The forgotten war that shattered Rome. The Battle of Teutoburg Forest. A name whispered in fear by those who still remember how an empire's pride was buried beneath the rain-soaked soil of a German wilderness. It began as a march of triumph. 3 Roman legions, banners high, shields gleaming, led by men who believed themselves invincible. They had conquered Gaul, crushed rebellions, and carried the eagle standards of Rome into every dark corner of the world. But in the autumn of 09 AD, that confidence would turn to terror, for deep within the mist-drenched forests of Germania, the trees themselves seemed to whisper betrayal. A trusted ally, a man Rome called friend, was guiding them into the heart of a trap. What unfolded over 3 endless days would become the bloodiest humiliation in Roman history. An ambush so devastating that Emperor Augustus himself was said to wander the halls of his palace, crying out, "Varus, give me back my legions." But how did the most disciplined army on earth fall so completely? And who was the man who outsmarted the greatest empire the world had ever known? That is the story you're about to witness. The Empire of Iron in XVIII, the year was 09 AD, and Rome stood at the height of its power. From the deserts of Syria to the cold mist of Britannia, the eagle of Rome had cast its shadow across the known world. Roads stretched like veins across conquered lands, carrying not just soldiers but the pulse of empire itself, trade, law, order, and fear. Yet on the empire's northern edge lay a world that refused to bow. A wild expanse of endless trees and hidden rivers, Germania. To Roman eyes it was a land of darkness, untamed and unreachable, where mist rose like ghosts and the air carried the scent of pine and rain. But the empire hungered for more. Governor Publius Quinctilius Varus was sent north with 3 legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, to turn that wilderness into a province. Varus was not a soldier's general but a politician, more accustomed to the marble halls of Rome than the shifting mud of forest paths. Still, he believed in Rome's invincibility. Everyone did. After all, hadn't they crushed every enemy that stood against them? But here's the shocking truth. Rome didn't understand the land it was marching into, or the people who called it home. To the tribes of Germania, freedom was sacred. Their loyalty belonged not to kings but to kin and to the gods of thunder and forest. They watched the Roman roads being built across their soil with growing rage. The legions demanded taxes. They seized hostages. They burned villages in the name of order. To Rome, it was civilization. To the Germans, it was invasion. And among them was one man who saw both sides. Arminius. He had been taken from his tribe as a child, raised in Rome as a hostage, taught Latin tactics and the discipline of empire. He wore their armor. He spoke their tongue. He fought for their glory. And Rome, in its arrogance, trusted him completely. But beneath that Roman veneer burned something ancient, a spark of vengeance. Arminius had seen what Rome did to his people. He had seen the arrogance in the eyes of men like Varus, men who believed the world was theirs by right. And so, while Rome thought they had made him loyal, he was learning how to destroy them from within. When Arminius returned to Germania as an auxiliary commander under Varus, he was welcomed as a hero, both by his tribesmen and by the Romans, who now saw him as the bridge between civilization and barbarism. But in secret, he began to weave his web. Tribe by tribe, he united the warring clans, Kalkriese, Bructeri, Marsi, ancient rivals who had never fought under one banner. He promised them revenge, freedom, and the blood of invaders. Meanwhile, Varus saw nothing. To him, Germania was already conquered. He enforced Roman law, built forts, and planned to make the region a permanent province. The local chiefs feasted at his table, all except one, Arminius, because Arminius wasn't there to feast. He was there to plan a funeral for Rome itself, but fate had something else planned first. Late that summer, news reached Varus of a rebellion deep in the forest. A few villages refusing to pay tribute. Nothing serious, or so he thought. Arminius stepped forward at once, loyal, eager, convincing. "Let me lead you there," he said. "I know these tribes. I can guide the legions through." the forest and crush this before it spreads. And Varus, blinded by arrogance, agreed. It was the decision that would doom them. The legions broke camp and began their march. 20,000 men, columns stretching for miles, laden with supply carts and families of officers who followed the army. The sky was gray, heavy with rain. The road narrowed. The hills closed in. Soon the solid Roman formation dissolved into a winding snake of men, armor clinking, boots sinking into mud. They were entering the Teutoburg Forest, a labyrinth of towering trees where the light barely reached the ground. The air was thick, the silence unnatural. And yet Arminius rode beside Varus, calm and smiling, promising victory. Most people never knew this detail. On the eve of that march, one Roman officer, Segestes, tried to warn Varus. He was a German noble and father-in-law to Arminius, and he saw what was coming. Arminius cannot be trusted, he pleaded. He's uniting the tribes. He's leading you into a trap. But Varus laughed. To question Arminius was to question Rome's judgment. And Rome did not doubt itself, and this is where everything changed. The rain came. Not a drizzle, but a storm that swallowed the world. Thunder echoed across the hills as the Roman column slowed to a crawl. Wagons stuck in the mud. Trees toppled across the paths. The order of march, so vital to Roman discipline, disintegrated. Shields slipped. Horses panicked, and then Arminius was gone. He had ridden ahead with a small detachment, claiming he would gather allied scouts. Varus thought nothing of it. Hours passed. The rain grew heavier. And then the first sound, a horn, faint, distant, followed by another. And another. From the trees came the first volley, javelins whistling through the air, striking with deadly precision. Men fell screaming. Horses reared. The Roman lines shattered before they even saw their enemy. The Germans were everywhere, invisible among the trees, their faces painted, their cries echoing like spirits in the mist. Arminius was among them, throwing off his Roman cloak, lifting his spear, and shouting words Rome could not understand, a cry of freedom, of vengeance, of home. What happened next? No historian expected. For 3 days the legions fought not an enemy, but the forest itself. Every tree concealed death. The narrow paths turned to rivers of mud. Roman discipline meant nothing in that chaos. Soldiers could not form ranks, could not see beyond the smoke and rain. The forest devoured them, and yet, in the heart of that nightmare, Varus refused to believe it was over. He still thought order could be restored. He tried to rally his men, his voice breaking through the din, but the ground itself seemed to swallow him. By the second night, fires flickered weakly in the rain. The moans of the wounded filled the air. Arminius had vanished again, his tribes melting back into the trees. Some Romans whispered that the gods themselves had turned against them. But here's the chilling truth. The trap wasn't finished. Arminius had planned for every step, every road, every choke point. He knew the Romans would try to retreat east, and he was already waiting there. The morning came, gray and lifeless. Varus ordered the remnants of his legions to move. What he didn't know was that Arminius had blocked their only escape with barricades of felled trees and hidden trenches. The first ranks advanced. The forest erupted again. Spears rained down. Arrows hissed. Panic took hold. The legions broke. Cohesion collapsed. Men dropped their shields and ran, only to find more enemies waiting in the fog. The sound was no longer battle. It was slaughter, and somewhere, through that chaos, Varus realized the truth. He had led Rome into its grave. By the third day, the survivors were surrounded. The standards, the golden eagles of Rome, were captured. Varus, unable to face the humiliation, fell on his own sword. One by one, the commanders followed. The forest claimed the rest. When the storm cleared, the Teutoburg Forest was silent again. But the ground was heavy, soaked with Roman blood. Months later, when scouts returned to the site, they found bones scattered across the earth, skulls nailed to trees and shattered armor glinting in the moss. 3 legions, gone. 20,000 souls, vanished. Back in Rome, word reached Emperor Augustus. They say he tore his robes, struck his head against the wall, and cried out for Varus, "Give me back my legions!" But they never returned, and yet this was not the end. Because in the ashes of Rome's greatest defeat, something new began to stir. Arminius, the savior of Germania, was now a hero, a liberator. But heroes born in blood seldom live in peace. As the tribes celebrated their freedom, old rivalries returned, and Rome, humiliated but not broken, began to plan its revenge, because empires do not forget, and in the shadows of that haunted forest, the next war was already waiting. The wolf and the eagle's shadow of the forest still whispered of blood. Months had passed since the massacre, but the Teutoburg woods had not forgotten. Every breeze seemed to carry the echo of Roman screams. Every raven that perched on a branch was a silent witness to the day an empire's pride was buried beneath the mud. And in the center of it all stood a man whose name would be both feared and forgotten. Arminius. To his people, he was the liberator. To Rome, he was the traitor who had torn out the empire's beating heart. But history, as always, would show that victory is never the end of war. It's only the beginning of another one, the war within. Arminius had done the impossible. He had united tribes that had spent generations killing each other. He had defeated the might of Rome with cunning, not numbers. But now, as the fires of celebration burned across Germania, another battle began. One fought not with swords, but with envy, politics, and pride. Because here's what most people never knew. Even as Arminius stood victorious, Rome was already plotting revenge. In the marble corridors of the imperial palace, Emperor Augustus was broken. He who had once ruled the world now ruled only his own rage. Reports said that for months after the news, he refused to cut his hair, refused to eat in public, muttering the same words every night. "Varus, give me back my legions." But grief in Rome was never idle. It turned into strategy, into vengeance. The empire began rebuilding. The destroyed legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, were never reformed, a scar carved into Rome's memory. But new legions were raised, new generals promoted, and spies sent into Germania. And watching all of it, far from Rome, was one man, Germanicus, nephew to Emperor Tiberius, young, brilliant, and burning for redemption. He would one day bring the Roman fury back to the forests. But that story still waited beyond the horizon. For now, the land belonged to Arminius, yet peace, true peace, never came. As winter's cold crept over the forests, the Germanic tribes began to splinter once again. Without the Romans to unite them in hatred, old rivalries resurfaced. Chieftains argued over spoils and power. Some accused Arminius of seeking to become a king, a word that, to free tribes, was as poisonous as betrayal, and in those cracks, Rome saw opportunity. Arminius's father-in-law, Segestes, who had once tried to warn Varus of his treachery, now turned against him openly. He called Arminius a tyrant, a murderer, a man cursed by the gods. Segestes still had Roman allies, and he sent messages across the border, offering his loyalty in exchange for protection. But Arminius was not a man who forgave betrayal. He gathered his warriors, his eyes burning with the same fury that had destroyed the legions and surrounded Segestes' stronghold. The old man's fortress fell quickly. And there, among the captives, was Arminius' own wife, the Snelda, Segestes' daughter. She was heavy with child. That night the fires burned low. Arminius stood beside her, the air thick with smoke and grief. He had loved her once, perhaps still did, but bloodlines had become weapons now, and love had no place between enemies. The Snelda's eyes did not waver. "Rome will come," she said softly, "and when it does, you will fall just as they did." Arminius said nothing. He only turned away, but fate was listening. Months later, a Roman raiding party under the command of a general named Caecina struck deep into Germania. They had one goal: to retrieve Segestes and his family. The Romans succeeded, rescuing the Snelda and taking her across the Rhine. When Arminius learned of it, he broke. He fell to his knees, clawing the earth, screaming into the sky like a wounded wolf. Witnesses said he raged so fiercely that his men feared to approach him. In one day, The man who had broken Rome's legions was broken by love, and this is where everything changed, because in that moment, Arminius's war became personal. It was no longer about freedom, it was about vengeance. Meanwhile, in Rome, the Snelda became a symbol. The woman who had once stood beside Rome's greatest enemy was paraded in triumph through the streets, her child, the son of Arminius, in her arms. The crowd roared as chains clinked around her wrists, and watching from the balcony, Emperor Tiberius smiled coldly. Rome had lost a battle, but not its appetite. Across the Rhine, the legions gathered again. Germanicus, young, determined, brilliant, prepared to lead them. His mission was not just conquest. It was redemption. The drums of war echoed once more through the forests, but for Arminius, the war had already begun in his heart. He knew Rome would come. He also knew that his fragile alliance of tribes could shatter at the first sign of weakness. Some already whispered that his victory at Teutoburg had been luck, that no man, no matter how cunning, could defeat Rome twice. Still, he gathered his warriors once more. He spoke of freedom, of vengeance, of the gods who had given them victory once and would again. His words cut through the cold air like blades. Rome believes we fear them, he said. But they should remember the forest. They should remember how it eats men whole. And yet, deep inside, even Arminius felt the weight of destiny pressing down. The Romans returned, and this time, they came prepared. In 14 AD, 5 years after Teutoburg, Germanicus crossed the Rhine with 6 legions. His scouts moved like wolves through the underbrush. His engineers rebuilt roads, and his soldiers advanced with vengeance burning in their eyes. He found the old battlefield, the bones still lying where they had fallen, the skulls nailed to trees. He buried the remains of the lost legions and swore to avenge them, and he would not have to wait long. Arminius struck from the shadows, testing the new Roman commander. But Germanicus was not Varus. He learned from every move, countered every ambush, and kept his legions tight and disciplined. Still, the Germans fought like spirits of the forest. Their attacks came by night, arrows in the fog, fires in the distance, the cries of unseen men. For months, the two sides circled each other like predators. Every clash fed the hatred on both sides. But here's what few know: in one of those battles, Arminius came face to face with his own brother Flavus, who had remained loyal to Rome. The two met across the river Weser. Arminius called out in their native tongue, begging his brother to return to his people. Flavus, wearing Roman armor, shouted back that Arminius was the enemy now, a traitor who had doomed his homeland to endless war. Witnesses said the argument turned to fury. Both men screaming across the water, their words drowned by the rush of the current. They never met again. The war raged on. Arminius struck Germanicus's legions at Idistiveso, a brutal, thunderous clash along the riverbanks. The Romans, though bloodied, held their ground. Thousands of Germans fell. The dream of total victory slipped from Arminius's grasp. And yet, he did not yield. He retreated into the deep forests once more, drawing the Romans further in, forcing them into the terrain that had destroyed Varus years before. But this time Rome was ready. Germanicus built bridges, cleared paths, and used allied tribes to scout ahead. The hunter had become the hunted, one stormy night. As Germanicus's forces camped near the Ems River, they found something strange in the trees: Roman standards. The very eagles lost at Teutoburg, now reclaimed from the earth. It was as if the ghosts of the fallen had been freed. For Rome, it was a sign, the curse was lifted. But for Arminius, it was the beginning of the end. His allies began to drift away. The tribes no longer trusted one another. Some envied his power. Others blamed him for provoking Rome again. Segestus's supporters plotted in secret, whispering that the gods were punishing Arminius for pride, and soon the truth became clear: Rome had not defeated him in battle. His own people would do that. In 21 AD, years after his greatest triumph, Arminius's own kin betrayed him. They lured him to a council, promising peace, and struck him down. The man who had destroyed 3 Roman legions died not by an enemy's blade, but by his own blood, and so ended the Volf who once wore the eagle's armor, but his legend refused to die. For centuries, The Romans would speak his name with bitterness, the one who halted their expansion into the heart of Europe. And in the lands of Germania, his story would pass from father to son, growing with every telling, until the man became a myth, a symbol of freedom against empire. Yet the forest that had swallowed legions would never rest. Beneath its soil lay bones, armor, and ghosts, silent witnesses to the day an empire learned the price of arrogance. But the question remains, did Arminius truly win? Because though he freed his people, he also condemned them to endless wars without unity, without peace. Rome fell centuries later. But Germania never became an empire, perhaps in some cruel way. The forest claimed them all, Roman and German alike, and somewhere between the trees and the mist, the echoes of that ancient betrayal still linger, waiting for the next empire bold enough to believe itself invincible. Into the green inferno the forest waited. Decades could pass, and still it would remain the same, a dark sea of green stretching beyond sight, its roots drinking the blood of empires. The Romans called it Silva impenetrabilis, the impassable forest. But for the people who lived within it, it was not a barrier. It was home. It was protection. It was a God. Now that God would be tested again, the year was 14 AD, the Emperor Augustus was dead. Rome mourned the passing of the man who had turned the Republic into empire. And in the midst of the empire's mourning, a name resurfaced, whispered in the Senate, murmured by soldiers, cursed in nightmares. Arminius, the Wolf who had torn apart 3 legions. The ghost who haunted Rome's pride, but a new emperor sat upon the throne now, Tiberius, cold and calculating. And where Augustus had grieved, Tiberius planned. He ordered vengeance, not for honor, but for deterrence. No one, not Parthia, not the tribes, not even the gods, would believe Rome could bleed and live. And so he chose his weapon. Germanicus Julius Caesar. Young, fearless, and loved by his men. Germanicus embodied what Rome wanted to believe about itself, noble, unstoppable, divine in destiny. When he crossed the Rhine, it was not just an army that entered Germania. It was Rome's memory, marching to reclaim its soul. The forest swallowed them whole. 6 legions, cavalry wings, auxiliaries, and siege engineers, a tide of iron and discipline pushing into the endless green. The air was heavy with mist. The men marched through silence broken only by the creak of armor and the dull rhythm of marching feet. Every step forward felt like defiance, a challenge to the ghosts that had haunted them since. Teutoburg, and then they found it, the old battlefield, half-buried bones, shattered shields, spears sticking from the soil like dead trees, the skulls of Roman officers nailed to the trunks of ancient oaks, eagles torn from their poles and trampled into the mud. The legions stood in silence. Some wept, others cursed. Germanius ordered the remains to be gathered and buried. Priests performed rites. The soldiers raised their torches high, their flames flickering through the mist. As Germanicus spoke, here fell the sons of Rome, not forgotten, not forsaken. By the will of Mars and Jupiter, their blood will be avenged. The forest watched, unmoved. But here's what no one expected. Arminius was watching too, from the shadows of the tree line. The Germanic leader saw the torches flicker and the Roman banners rise again. For 5 years, he had held the tribes together through fear, through memory of the great victory. But now, seeing the legions march once more through his homeland, he felt something new, unease. The Romans had learned. Their armor gleamed less. Their formations moved tighter. They no longer laughed around campfires or carried families along the march. They were not the same Rome that had bled in the mud of Teutoburg. These were wolves returning to their den, silent, hungry, and merciless, and Arminius knew if he didn't stop them now, everything he fought for would burn. He called the tribes again. Carusi chatti bructeri, they came, though reluctantly. Old wounds reopened. Some chiefs murmured that Arminius had brought Rome's fury upon them. Others said he had grown too proud, too obsessed with his own legend. Still, they followed because in every man's heart there was the memory of that day when Rome fell screaming among the trees, and every man longed to feel that power again, The battle began not with armies, but with shadows. Arminius's warriors struck Roman supply lines, ambushed scouts, poisoned wells. They attacked the flanks, vanishing before a counterstrike could land. Each night the forest came alive, the cries of war horns echoing through the fog, fires flaring at the edges of the camps, but Germanicus held firm. He had studied Arminius, his tactics, his cunning, his pride. He refused to be drawn deep into the wilderness. Instead, he advanced carefully, clearing paths, building fortified camps, forcing the tribes to attack on his terms. And then came the moment every soldier dreaded, the river crossing at Weser. The rain fell without mercy. The banks turned to mud. The air stank of wet leather and sweat. On the opposite side, the Germanic tribes assembled, countless, wild, screaming their gods' names to the thunder. Between them, the river churned like liquid iron. Arminius rode before his warriors, his long hair soaked, his eyes burning. "There," he shouted, pointing across the water. "There stand the men who enslave the world. Their walls are of stone, but their hearts are of dust. Today we show them that the forest remembers." Germanicus, standing on the opposite bank, raised his hand, calm, cold, deliberate. He gave no speech. He didn't need to. Every man in his ranks knew why they were here. The horns sounded, the battle erupted like the sky itself had shattered. Arrows screamed through the rain. The river turned red as men slipped, drowned, fought. The Germanic warriors crashed into the Roman lines. But this time they met a wall of shields, unmoving, relentless. Arminius charged into the fray, cutting down soldier after soldier. His armor was splattered with mud and blood. His cries echoed through the chaos. For a moment it felt like Teutoburg again. The Romans pressed. The forest alive, the air filled with thunder and death, but Germanicus had set a trap. Hidden reserves surged forward, closing around Arminius's flanks. The tribes began to break, their formations collapsing into confusion. The Romans advanced with brutal precision, shields locking, spears thrusting in unison, driving the enemy back step by step. Arminius fought to rally them. "Hold!" he roared. "The gods are with us." But even the gods seemed to falter that day. The rain stopped. The sun broke through the clouds, glinting off the Roman eagles. To the Germans, it looked as though Jupiter himself had lit the field in Rome's favor. When the day ended, the ground was littered with corpses. Thousands of Germans lay dead or dying. The river carried their bodies downstream, a crimson current flowing through the heart of the forest. Germanicus had won, but victory in Germania was never simple. The deeper the legions advanced, the heavier the forest became, as if the land itself resisted them. The trees thickened. The air grew colder. Even their torches struggled to stay lit. And then the ground trembled. In the distance, smoke rose. A new army was gathering, one that had been waiting for this moment. Arminius had not been crushed. He had vanished into the forest, gathering survivors, calling for vengeance. When the Romans marched through the narrow valleys days later, the trap was already set. From the cliffs above came an avalanche of rocks and logs. The sky darkened with javelins. The front ranks fell. The middle broke. Panic spread like fire. For hours the forest screamed. Germanicus, realizing the danger, rallied his cavalry and charged uphill, cutting through the chaos. His standard-bearers raised the eagle high, their voices rising over the carnage. Slowly, impossibly, the legions reformed, fighting their way out of the death trap. When night fell, the Romans had survived, bloodied but unbroken. The next morning, they found the enemy gone. Only the dead remained. Germanicus ordered his men to march back toward the Rhine. The campaign had cost too much, gained too little. He knew now what Varus had not. Germania could not be conquered, only endured. But in the silence that followed, both sides claimed victory. Rome said they had avenged the legions of Teutoburg. Germania said they had driven Rome back once more. And in truth, both were right and both were wrong, because neither had broken the other. As the legions withdrew, Arminius watched from a ridge, his face unreadable. His dream of unity was gone. His people had bled for freedom, But freedom had no crown, no walls, no peace. Still, as he looked upon the endless forest, the same that had sheltered his ancestors and swallowed Rome, he knew one thing: empires rise and fall, but the land endures. He turned away, his figure fading into the mist. The green inferno closed behind him once more, sealing its secrets in silence, but deep beneath the soil, the echoes of that war remained, iron, bone, and memory. The forest had devoured legions and legends alike, and it was still hungry because history, like the forest, never sleeps. It waits. The forest of Teutoburg began again with silence, not the peace of still air, but that haunting quiet before something ancient awakens. The Teutoburg Forest, once the scene of Rome's humiliation, now waited, as if the earth itself was holding its breath for what would come next. Germanicus had returned. It was the year 15 AD, and the legions of Rome once again crossed the Rhine, marching into the same nightmare that had swallowed their fathers. This time they came in greater numbers, hardened by the lessons of blood. The soldiers carried not hope but vengeance. Their armor was darker, their faces older. They no longer sang. They no longer underestimated the land or the enemy. Every man knew the stories of the ghosts that haunted the trees, of comrades whose bones still slept beneath the roots. And now they would walk those same paths, determined to rewrite what fate had written. Germanicus led them, proud, relentless, haunted. He was not Varus, he was not a fool. But as his legions advanced, the fog thickened, the trees closed in, and soon even the bravest among them began to feel it, that ancient dread that lived in the soil. "Do you hear it?" a soldier whispered. "The forest remembers." And indeed it did. They marched through swamps where the dead had fallen years before. Spears still jutted from the ground, rusted but unbroken. Roman helmets lay half-buried, staring up with empty eyes. Ravens circled above, as if guiding them deeper into the abyss. The further they went, the less human the forest seemed. The trunks twisted like bones, the branches clawed at the sky. At night, when the wind howled through the leaves, it sounded like voices, Roman, Germanic, ancient, all calling for something that would never come. Then, one evening, as the mist rolled low, the first arrow came. It struck a centurion through the neck. He didn't even scream, more followed. The forest came alive with movement, shadows darting between trees, the faint gleam of axes, the glint of spearheads. Arminius had returned. Though his army was scattered and his alliances frayed, his spirit burned fiercer than ever. This was his forest, his home, his weapon, his altar. He would not let Rome claim it. The first attacks were swift, brutal, and unpredictable. The Romans would set camp, and before dawn, fires would erupt at the perimeter. Horses cut loose, guards found with throats slit. Scouts sent into the trees vanished. Drums echoed in the night, sometimes near, sometimes impossibly far, as though the forest itself mocked them. But Germanicus refused to retreat. "Let them come," he said. "Let them remember who we are." And so the Romans pressed forward, building fortified camps as they advanced, each one a scar carved into the wilderness. They felled trees, drained swamps, forced the land to obey. For every ambush they answered with fire and iron. Villages were burned, fields trampled, captives crucified along the roads. But for every victory, the forest took something back. The deeper they went, the more unnatural everything became. The mist never lifted. Compasses failed. Soldiers swore the trees moved when they weren't looking. Some began to dream of the dead, of Varus, of their lost comrades, of their own graves waiting ahead. Then came the march to Angravarian wall, a narrow ridge where Arminius waited. He had chosen his ground well. The Romans would have to cross marshland to reach him, their footing uncertain, their lines exposed. But Germanicus was ready. He ordered his cavalry wide, flanking the enemy from both sides, while his legions advanced slowly through the mire, shields locked. Spears low, the two forces collided with a thunder that shook the earth. The Germans screamed their gods' names and hurled themselves against the Roman wall. Spears shattered, swords clanged, men slipped in blood and mud. The sound was deafening, metal on bone, shields splintering. The roar of thousands fighting for breath. Germanicus rode among his men, his armor black with dirt, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Rome does not fall twice," he shouted. Arminius saw him across the field, the golden crest, the unflinching command. Their eyes met through the smoke. In that single glance was everything: defiance, hatred, respect. The wolf and the eagle, staring into each other's souls. Arminius charged. He broke through the Roman front, cutting down a standard-bearer and seizing the eagle. His warriors cheered, their morale igniting like fire. For a heartbeat, it seemed as if history would repeat itself. Another Teutoburg, another Roman nightmare, but fate rarely repeats. It evolves. Germanicus unleashed his reserves. A sudden surge of legionaries struck the Germanic flank, driving deep into their line. Cavalry thundered from the marsh edge, trapping the tribes between sword and swamp. Arminius fought like a beast cornered by fate. He cut, dodged, and bled, his men falling around him in heaps. When his horse went down, he fought on foot, his face streaked with blood and rain. But as the battle turned, something else happened, something few recorded but many whispered. Arminius vanished. One moment, he was there, cutting through Roman ranks. The next, gone, swallowed by the fog. Some said he escaped into the forest. Others said he fell into the marsh and the earth closed over him. No body was ever found. The battle ended with Germanicus's victory. Thousands of Germanic warriors lay dead, their bodies half buried in the mud. The Roman banners rose high once more, their eagles glinting like vengeance reborn. When the storm cleared, the forest was silent again. Germanicus stood on the ridge, watching smoke rise from the battlefield. His officers urged him onward, to press the attack, to cross deeper, to end the threat forever, but he didn't. He looked at the trees, endless and indifferent, and he understood. Germania could be beaten, but never conquered. Its strength was not in cities or walls, but in the wild heart of its people, and the land that shielded them. And so he turned back. The legions withdrew, their armor scarred, their spirits heavy but proud. Behind them, the forest swallowed their tracks once more, as if erasing proof that men had ever walked there. But back in Rome, the Senate was restless. Tiberius, jealous of Germanicus's rising fame, feared the young general's popularity more than any barbarian. When Germanicus returned to report his victories, the emperor's praise was cold, his orders final: no more campaigns across the Rhine. Germania was to be left to its ghosts, and the ghosts multiplied for years after. Travelers who passed through the Teutoburg Forest spoke of strange lights flickering between the trees, of drums beating in the distance, of whispers in Latin and ancient Germanic tongues mingling like smoke. Some claimed to see armored figures walking through the mist, not men, but memories. Even centuries later, when Rome's empire stretched no more, the forest remained untouched, eternal, haunted. But here's the truth most never hear. The true cost of Teutoburg was not measured in the dead. It was in the fear it carved into Rome's heart. The empire that had conquered continents would never again try to cross the Elbe. The line was drawn. Invisible but absolute, Rome's power would grow elsewhere, in marble cities and distant deserts, in the glory of Caesar and the shadow of Christ, but never again among these trees. And in that silence, Germania remained unconquered, untamed. Eternal. The memory of Varus faded. The name of Germanicus became legend. But Arminius, he became something more. To his enemies, a phantom. To his people, a god. To history, the reminder that even empires bleed. And yet, as centuries passed, the forest still whispered, because the war was never truly over. The bones beneath the soil still spoke of pride and betrayal, of freedom and fury. And every empire that rose after Rome would feel it, that quiet warning from the trees. The forest does not forget. And when the mist rises again, it will remember every man who believed himself invincible. Echoes of XVIII. The empire that once ruled the known world had learned to fear the shadows of trees, long after the clash of swords had faded, and the last Roman banner withdrew across the Rhine. The story of Teutoburg still echoed through marble halls and soldiers' songs. Rome, eternal, invincible. Divine had been humbled by a wilderness and a man who was never meant to be its enemy, but time is merciless. It does not keep the faces of heroes. It keeps their consequences. Years had passed since Germanicus's campaign, his victories, his withdrawal, his quiet death under suspicious circumstances in Syria. Rome had celebrated him, then buried him, and turned its gaze elsewhere. New emperors rose. New wars began. Yet the forest never released its grip on Rome's soul, and within that forest, something darker had taken root, not just the bones of the fallen, but the memory of arrogance. When the mist came, locals said you could still hear it, the clash of iron, the cry of dying men, the whisper of Arminius's voice in the wind. Rome believed it conquered the world, it said. But no one conquers the forest. Arminius himself was long gone, cut down not by Roman steel, but by his own kin. His body was burned, his ashes scattered, his name spoken in fear and reverence. To some he was a murderer, to others a god, to all a warning, and still his legacy refused to rest, because what began as one man's rebellion had reshaped the fate of empires. The Teutoburg disaster forced Rome to retreat, not just in geography but in ambition. The empire turned inward, fortifying, walling, consolidating. The Rhine became the border not of conquest but of containment. On the maps of emperors and scholars, Germania was no longer a future province. It was a blank, a place of mystery and danger. The forest had become the edge of the world. But fate, as always, had one more echo to deliver, centuries later. Long after the eagles of Rome had tarnished and the empire's borders had begun to crumble, men would dig in those same forests, peasants, wanderers, treasure seekers, and uncover fragments of that lost age. A rusted sword, a broken helmet, a coin bearing the face of Augustus. Each relic was a whisper, and with every discovery came the same haunting thought that somewhere, deep beneath the roots, the story was still alive. Historians would call it the battle that changed history. Philosophers would call it the moment when fate humbled empire. But for the Romans who survived it, for the men who saw the forest consume their legions, it was something simpler. It was a nightmare that never ended, because here's what most people never knew. The survivors of Teutoburg did not all die. Some were taken, captured Romans were enslaved among the tribes. Some were sacrificed to the gods. Others, a few dozen, perhaps a few hundred, lived out their lives in Germanic villages, forgotten by their homeland. They taught Latin words to their captors' children. They forged iron in Roman ways. They built walls that the tribes did not understand, and over generations, those fragments of Rome became part of Germania itself. Ghostly pieces of an empire that would never rule there again. One legend tells of a small Roman fort, far beyond the Rhine, manned by descendants of those lost legions. They guarded their own small world, neither Roman nor German, carrying on the rituals of their ancestors, waiting for orders that would never come, a myth perhaps. But myths, like ghosts, often grow from a grain of truth. Even in Rome, the memory of Teutoburg never healed. Every emperor knew the story. Every general felt its weight. When new campaigns were planned across distant frontiers, in Parthia, in Dacia, in Britannia, there was always one unspoken reminder: remember the forest. Augustus's lament, Varus, give me back my legions, became a phrase of dread, whispered whenever ambition outgrew caution. It was no longer about Varus, it was about the cost of forgetting that empires, too, can die, and yet human pride never learns easily. Centuries after the fall of Rome, when new powers rose from its ashes, when kings and emperors dreamed again of uniting Europe, they would look to that same forest and see destiny waiting. In the 16th century, German poets called Arminius Hermann der Cherusker the savior of Germany. He became not a rebel, but a symbol, a myth reborn in the fires of nationalism. Statues were raised, songs were sung. The man who once fought for his tribe became a hero for a nation that did not yet exist, but history is never kind to those it resurrects, because in every retelling, truth fades and pride returns. The lesson of Teutoburg, that arrogance destroys even the mighty, was slowly replaced by legend. Glory and revenge. And as centuries passed, armies marched again through those same lands, under new banners with new gods. But the same hunger, they too would learn that the forest always wins, even in modern times. When archaeologists unearthed the battlefield, the soil still held the story, the broken armor, the coins stamped with the names of lost legions, the spearheads bent from impact. They found human remains mixed with horses, bones gnawed by wolves, teeth marks on shields. It was not just history. It was memory, raw and undying, and as the world looked on, scholars said the same thing in hushed awe: this is where Rome stopped. But for those who truly understood, those who looked beyond empire and ambition, Teutoburg was not about where Rome ended. It was about where hubris began, because even after 2,000 years, the story feels familiar. Great powers rising, believing themselves unbreakable, invading lands they do not understand, underestimating those who live by the earth rather than the law. And every single time, the forest finds them. That is the eternal echo, the lesson that Arminius carved into history with mud and blood, the warning that Augustus never heeded, the shadow that Germanicus could not escape. The empire may change, the weapons may evolve, the banners may fade, but the echo remains. Power blinds, pride burns, and the forest remembers. They say that on quiet nights, when the mist rolls across the hills of northern Germany, you can still hear it, faint but clear. The tramp of legionary boots, the crack of thunder, the whisper of a voice calling through the trees. Come deeper, come find what Rome forgot. And those who hear it, historians, wanderers, dreamers, always describe the same feeling: a chill, a pull, a sense that the story is not finished, because perhaps it isn't. Perhaps every empire that rises must one day walk into its own forest, its own Teutoburg, where ambition meets consequence and the earth demands payment in blood. And when that day comes, somewhere in the dark, the spirit of Arminius will smile once more, for though he died betrayed, and though his people never ruled as one, his victory became eternal, not in land, not in wealth, but in warning. The forest keeps his name, the mist keeps his secret, and the world, still chasing the illusion of empire, keeps repeating his story. So listen closely when the wind moves through the trees, when thunder rolls across an empty field, when history trembles with the same mistakes once more. That is not just the sound of weather, that is the echo of Teutoburg, the echo of defeat that every empire will one day hear.